Tell me honestly, have you ever trusted someone so deeply, only to realize they were your biggest danger? What would you do if the person you loved most turned into your greatest nightmare? Stay with me, because this story will break your heart and open your eyes. Please like, share, and subscribe. The night was supposed to be quiet, peaceful, just another evening inside the Carter mansion. Yet what happened within those walls would soon become a headline, a scandal whispered in every corner of the city. Elena Carter, 6 months pregnant and already fragile from exhaustion, never imagined that the man she once believed was her protector would turn into her greatest threat. Damian Carter, her husband, was a millionaire with the kind of arrogance that money breeds. He lived in a marble palace, drove cars worth more than most people's homes, and carried himself like a king. But behind closed doors, his charm dissolved into something darker. That night, Elena discovered just how dangerous his temper could be. The fight began over something small, as it usually did. Elena had asked Damian to come home earlier to help her prepare for the baby. He rolled his eyes, muttering about ungrateful wives and nagging voices. He claimed he worked day and night to give her luxury, and all she could do was complain. She tried to stay calm, reminding him that she wasn't asking for diamonds or vacations, just his presence, just a father for their child. Her words, instead of softening him, ignited his rage. Damian grabbed the thick leather-bound novel resting on the coffee table, a book he had been flaunting as part of his intellectual image. Without hesitation, he hurled it across the room. The sound was brutal. The book struck Elena's temple with sickening force. She gasped, staggered, and collapsed to the ground. The world around her spun, her vision dimmed, and the last thing she heard was the echo of Damian's cold voice. Pathetic. The maid screamed. Guests in the hallway rushed into the living room. They saw Elena on the floor, unconscious, her hand still clutching her swollen belly. Someone dialed 911 with trembling fingers. Damian, instead of showing remorse, barked orders to everyone else. Don't exaggerate. She's fine. Just a faint. Stay out of this. But nothing could hide the horror on his face when Elena failed to wake. Minutes later, paramedics burst through the mansion doors. They lifted Elena onto a stretcher, her pale face framed by strands of dark hair. Blood trickled near her hairline, where the book had hit. The baby's heartbeat had to be checked immediately. Time was running out. Damian followed, but only to protect his reputation, not out of love. He muttered about paparazzi, about what investors might say if this story leaked. To him, Elena was no longer a wife, but a liability. At the hospital, doctors worked quickly. The diagnosis was clear: concussion. Elena would need monitoring, rest, and protection from further stress. For a pregnant woman, the risk was doubled. The slightest shock could affect both mother and child. That's when Margaret Lewis arrived. Margaret Lewis was not just Elena's mother. She was one of the city's most respected neurologists. Her reputation in medicine was legendary. Calm, brilliant, relentless in pursuit of justice, she had spent decades protecting patients from the devastation of brain injuries. But nothing could prepare her for the sight of her own daughter lying in a hospital bed, her unborn grandchild's future uncertain. When Margaret asked what had happened, the nurse hesitated. Then she whispered, "Your son-in-law." He threw a book at her. The world seemed to freeze. Margaret's eyes hardened. Her hands, steady from years of performing delicate procedures, clenched into fists. She turned to Damian, who stood in the corner, pretending to check his phone. "You did this?" Her voice cut through the sterile air like a blade. Damian smirked, trying to deflect. "It was an accident. She provoked me. She needs to stop dramatizing everything. It's not like I hit her with my hand." The audacity of his words shocked even the nurses. For Margaret, it was confirmation. Damian had no remorse, no soul. She stepped closer, her voice low but burning with fury. "Listen carefully, Damian. You may think your money protects you, but I am not afraid of you. You harmed my daughter and risked the life of my grandchild. I will make sure the world knows what you are." For the first time, Damian's smugness flickered. He laughed it off in front of others, but deep inside, he realized this woman was not like Elena. Margaret would not be silenced. By morning, word had already begun to spread. Hospital staff whispered about the millionaire who had assaulted his pregnant wife. Security cameras in the mansion revealed enough to raise eyebrows. reporters caught wind of the ambulance at the Carter estate. The first sparks of scandal were igniting, and Margaret, standing at her daughter's bedside, made a silent vow. She would not allow this crime to be swept under a silk rug. She would press charges. She would drag Damian Carter into court, strip away his shield of money and power, and expose him for the monster he truly was. The hook had been set. The story of a millionaire's downfall had just begun. But little did Damian know, the neurologist he had underestimated was about to become his worst nightmare. Before the night of the assault, before the mansion filled with flashing ambulance lights, Elena Carter had lived in the shadows of luxury. To the outside world, she seemed blessed. A young wife married to one of the city's wealthiest men, dressed in fine clothes, living in a mansion with marble floors and crystal chandeliers. Strangers assumed her life was a fairy tale. But behind the closed doors of that glittering estate, Elena's reality was much darker. Elena was 29 years old, a school teacher by profession. Teaching had been her passion since childhood. She loved children, loved shaping young minds, loved the innocence that reminded her of hope. She used to believe her calling in life was simple: to create a classroom where students felt safe, loved, and encouraged. When she stood in front of a chalkboard, marker in hand, she felt alive. But everything changed when she met Damian Carter. He was charming at first, as men like him always are. Their first meeting had been at a charity fundraiser hosted by the city's elite. Elena had attended as a guest of a fellow teacher whose aunt worked at the event. She had felt out of place among the diamonds and designer gowns, her simple navy dress borrowed from a friend. Yet it was there, under the glitter of chandeliers, that Damian spotted her. He approached her with confidence, his tuxedo perfectly tailored, his smile smooth enough to melt walls. "You don't belong here," he said with a chuckle. "And I mean that as a compliment. Everyone else is pretending. You look real." She blushed, not used to being the center of attention. Damian leaned into that innocence, weaving stories of his hard-working rise, claiming he admired her simplicity. Within weeks, he swept her into his world. He sent flowers to her classroom, whisked her away to dinners at restaurants she had only read about, and whispered promises of forever. For a girl who had lost her father early and grown up watching her mother, Dr. Margaret Lewis, work day and night at the hospital, Damian seemed like a dream. For the first time, Elena felt chosen, cherished. 6 months later, they married. At first, married life was sweet. Damian showered her with gifts, jewelry boxes, designer dresses, trips abroad. Elena didn't care for the diamonds. She cared for the moments when she thought she had found love. She would cook him dinner, wait for him to come home, and dream about the family they would build together. But as months turned into years, the mask began to slip. Damian's temper was sharp. Small disagreements became shouting matches. He belittled her dreams, telling her teaching was a hobby for women who couldn't handle real ambition. He demanded she quit her job, claiming no wife of his should work like a servant. Against her will, Elena left the classroom. The chalkboard she once loved became a memory. Her life narrowed to the mansion, the garden, and the endless, suffocating silence of wealth. When Elena discovered she was pregnant, her heart filled with fragile joy. She thought maybe, just maybe, the baby would soften Damian. Maybe fatherhood would remind him of love, of gentleness. For a few weeks, she saw glimpses of the man she had fallen for. He touched her belly with awe, promised to build the perfect nursery. Even boasted to his business partners about becoming a father. But the tenderness didn't last. As her belly grew, so did his irritation. He complained about her weight, about her slower pace, about the medical bills. He stayed out late, whispered on the phone, and brushed off her questions with coldness. Elena suspected another woman, but she had no proof. What she did have was the sinking realization that the man she loved no longer existed. Her only comfort came from her mother. Margaret Lewis, though busy as a neurologist, always made time to call, to check in, to remind her daughter she was not alone. But Elena, ashamed of her crumbling marriage, often downplayed her struggles. She wanted her mother to believe she was happy. She wanted to believe it herself. Still, the truth gnawed at her. She was a prisoner inside a palace. On the day Damian threw the book, Elena had been folding tiny baby clothes in the nursery. She had smiled at the little yellow onesies, imagined the sound of laughter filling the cold halls. For one fleeting moment, she felt hopeful. She believed she could survive the loneliness, as long as her baby had love. But Damian's rage that night shattered that illusion. When the book struck her head, it didn't just knock her unconscious, it ripped away the last thread of her denial. She realized then that her husband was not just cruel, he was dangerous. Elena's vulnerability was the cruelest part of it all. She had given up her independence, her job, her voice, all for a man who now treated her like an inconvenience. She was 6 months pregnant, unable to run, too exhausted to fight back, trapped in a gilded cage. Yet inside her lay a strength she didn't know she had. It was hidden beneath fear, buried under years of silence, but it was there. And when she awoke in the hospital to her mother's determined gaze, something shifted. For the first time in years, Elena felt a spark of hope. She saw that she wasn't alone. Her mother's presence reminded her of the power she came from, the resilience in her bloodline. And in that fragile hospital bed, holding her belly, Elena whispered a promise to her unborn child. "I will protect you, no matter what. We will not be broken." Her story was not just about suffering. It was about survival. And though the road ahead would be filled with battles, both in court and in her heart, Elena Carter was about to discover that even the weakest bird can learn to fly again when the storm forces her wings open. But what Elena didn't know was that Damian had already begun plotting, desperate to silence her before the scandal destroyed him. The Carter mansion stood on the edge of the city like a monument to excess. Its gates were iron and gold, its driveway lined with marble statues imported from Europe. From the outside, it was breathtaking. The kind of place people slowed down to stare at. The kind of place that appeared in glossy magazines under captions like American Success. But for Elena Carter, it had never felt like a home. The marble floors were cold, echoing with every step. The chandeliers sparkled above her, but their light never brought warmth. The walls, covered with expensive paintings, seemed to close in on her more each day. The mansion wasn't built for family or laughter. It was built for display, a stage where Damian could parade his wealth. For Elena, every room carried the weight of silence. The nursery had been the only exception. She had poured her heart into it, painting the walls a soft yellow, choosing a crib with carved details, placing stuffed animals on the shelves. It was the one space that reflected her dreams instead of Damian's ego. But even there, she could feel the tension. Damian had scoffed when she decorated it herself. "We could have hired a designer," he said. "You're making it look cheap." The house was beautiful, yes, but beauty without love is a cage. And Elena lived in that cage, day after day, until the night everything shattered. When the paramedics carried her out, the grand staircase and gilded mirrors seemed almost to mock her. Guests who had once envied her now whispered in shock, their voices blending with the wail of the ambulance siren. That mansion, which had looked so perfect from the street, was now marked by scandal. The hospital was another world entirely. Gone were the polished marble floors and glittering chandeliers. Here the air was heavy with antiseptic, the beeping of machines, the shuffle of nurses' shoes on tile. Yet, oddly, it felt more like home to Elena than the mansion ever had. The nurses treated her with kindness. Doctors spoke to her as a person, not an accessory. For the first time in a long while, she was surrounded by people who cared about her well-being. Her hospital room was small, with beige walls and fluorescent lights that hummed faintly, but to Elena, it was a sanctuary. It was here that she felt her baby kick, reminding her she was still alive, still fighting. It was here that her mother sat beside her, holding her hand, refusing to leave her side. The hospital became a symbol, not of weakness but of survival. Yet even there, the shadow of Damian lingered. He visited once, striding in with his suit still crisp, acting as though nothing had happened. "We'll keep this quiet," he said in a low voice, his eyes scanning the room as if cameras might appear. "You'll tell them it was an accident. No one needs to know. Think about the baby, Elena. Scandal isn't good for children." Elena turned her face away. For the first time, she didn't argue or cry. She simply let the silence hang heavy between them. Damian left in frustration, muttering about lawyers and business meetings. That was the last time he came to the hospital. From then on, the courtroom became the next stage. It wasn't long before Margaret Lewis, Elena's mother, filed charges. The courthouse was an imposing building in the heart of downtown with gray stone columns that seemed to touch the sky. Reporters crowded the steps, microphones raised like weapons, waiting for a glimpse of the millionaire accused of assaulting his pregnant wife. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. The courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper. Every seat was filled. Journalists scribbling notes, curious onlookers leaning forward, even members of high society who came not for justice, but for gossip. The judge sat at the bench with a stern face, her gavel ready to strike at the slightest disruption. On one side sat Elena, pale but dignified, her belly a visible reminder of the stakes. Her mother sat beside her, radiating calm fury, her medical expertise lending weight to the charges. On the other side sat Damian, flanked by expensive lawyers in sharp suits. He wore his arrogance like armor, smirking as if the whole process were beneath him. The contrast was striking. Elena, the woman once seen as fragile, now appeared strong in her silence. Damian, the man once admired, now looked small beneath the weight of his own actions. The setting of the courtroom carried its own kind of drama. Every creak of a chair, every shuffle of papers, every murmur from the crowd seemed to magnify the tension. When the prosecutor described how Damian had thrown the book, people gasped. When Margaret took the stand, explaining in precise medical terms the danger of a concussion during pregnancy, the room went silent. Even the walls seemed to listen. The courtroom became more than a place of law. It became a theater where truth and lies battled under the eyes of the public. For Elena, it was terrifying, but also liberating. Here she was no longer locked inside a mansion. Here she could finally speak, finally be heard. The three settings, the mansion, the hospital, and the courtroom, were not just places, they were symbols. The mansion represented the prison of wealth and appearances. The hospital represented survival and the beginning of healing. And the courtroom represented justice, the battleground where power would be stripped and truth would rise. Elena's journey would move through each of these stages, transforming her from a silenced wife into a woman with a voice strong enough to shatter walls. But as the first hearing ended, a chilling rumor spread. Damian had a plan to turn the case in his favor, one that could ruin Elena before she even found her strength. Damian Carter had mastered the art of deception. To the world, he was a self-made millionaire, a business genius who had clawed his way from nothing to the top of the city's elite. He was the man who could shake hands with politicians at lunch and close million-dollar deals over cocktails by dinner. His name was splashed across financial magazines, his face often framed by the phrase, "Visionary of the Year." But the truth was uglier. Damian's rise to wealth had not been built on brilliance alone, but on ruthlessness. He thrived on manipulation, exploiting weaknesses in competitors and colleagues. Deals were won not by innovation, but by intimidation. He had a way of looking someone in the eye and convincing them they were lucky to be cheated. It was that same cold charisma that had first pulled Elena into his orbit. He knew how to charm. He knew how to smile just long enough to make people trust him. And he knew how to hide his darkness until the moment he no longer needed the mask. Behind closed doors, Damian was not the suave businessman the magazines adored. He was controlling, demanding, quick to anger. He saw people, especially women, not as partners, but as possessions. Elena, to him, had been a prize. At first he paraded her like a trophy, the beautiful school teacher who made him look like a family man. But once the wedding vows were spoken, once she was safely trapped inside his world, the admiration faded. What replaced it was contempt. He mocked her teaching career, sneering that her salary was pocket change. He insisted she quit, declaring that a Carter wife doesn't punch a time clock. He told her what to wear, how to speak, even how to smile at parties. Whenever she resisted, he reminded her of her dependency. "You'd be nothing without me," he'd whisper in the dead of night. And yet, in public, he played the part of the devoted husband. Arm around her waist at galas, hand resting protectively on her shoulder, voice dripping with pride as he spoke about his beautiful wife. He fooled almost everyone. But he couldn't fool Elena forever. By the time she became pregnant, Damian's double life had grown harder to hide. He stayed out late under the excuse of business dinners. He received texts at all hours, which he read with a smirk before turning his phone face down. He suddenly became careful with his cologne, careful to shower before bed. Elena recognized the signs, though she had no proof. Then came Cassandra. Cassandra Blake was 27, ambitious and stunning in the way of women who know the power of their beauty. She worked as a junior consultant at one of Damian's companies, though work was hardly what kept her close. She was the opposite of Elena. Bold where Elena was gentle, loud where Elena was quiet, ruthless where Elena was forgiving. Cassandra didn't want love, she wanted status. And Damian, with his money and arrogance, gave her exactly that. He flaunted Cassandra at business events, introducing her as a promising strategist. But the lingering touches, the private smiles, the way his eyes followed her across the room, all of it spoke of something more. Rumors swirled, and while Elena suffered in silence, Cassandra basked in the attention. It was Cassandra who fueled much of Damian's cruelty. She whispered that Elena was weak, boring, too soft for a man of his stature. She urged him to be free, to rid himself of the wife who dragged him down. Damian listened, because Cassandra fed the very monster inside him, the one that thrived on control and humiliation. When Damian threw that book at Elena, it wasn't just anger. It was years of entitlement and poison, sharpened by Cassandra's voice in his ear. To him, it wasn't violence, it was discipline. That was how twisted his world had become. But what Damian never understood was that arrogance has a price. His entire life had been built on the belief that money erased consequences. He bribed his way out of scandals, silenced employees with payoffs, and buried lawsuits before they reached the public. He believed Elena would be no different. Yet, as the courtroom lights shone on his smug face, cracks began to appear in his carefully polished mask. The prosecutor painted him not as a genius, but as a bully. The audience gasped when they heard how he'd struck his pregnant wife. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras clicked, and for the first time, Damian's wealth didn't feel like protection. It felt like evidence of arrogance. Still, Damian wasn't ready to lose. He leaned on his lawyers, crafting a defense of misunderstanding. He whispered to Cassandra about staging an alibi. He even hinted at paying off a witness. In his mind, the trial wasn't about truth. It was about survival. And deep down, Damian was terrified. Not of prison, not of public shame, but of losing control. Because if Elena found her voice, if Margaret succeeded in exposing him, then Damian's empire would crumble. And the man who once believed himself untouchable would stand naked before the world. The villain was powerful, yes, but he was also desperate. And desperation makes monsters even more dangerous. That night, after the first day in court, Damian returned to his penthouse suite at a luxury hotel. Cassandra waited for him, draped across velvet cushions, a glass of champagne in her hand. "You'll crush them, won't you?" she purred. Damian smirked, but his eyes betrayed the storm inside. "They think they can corner me," he muttered, "but I always find a way out." He raised his glass as if to toast to his own invincibility. But neither he nor Cassandra knew that the walls were already closing in. And this time, money wouldn't be enough to save him. For days after the hospital incident, Damian Carter convinced himself he was still in control. He had spent years crafting his image as a brilliant millionaire, a man admired for his sharp mind and philanthropic gestures. Surely, he thought, a single outburst at home could be buried. He hired the best attorneys, tightened the loyalty of his staff, and even threatened the maid who had witnessed everything. "Not a word," he warned, his voice low and cold. "If this leaks, your career in this city is over." But scandals have a way of slipping through cracks no money can seal. It began with whispers in the hospital. Nurses talked to other nurses who told friends, who told reporters. Soon, tabloids ran bold headlines, "Millionaire's pregnant wife hospitalized after mysterious injury." At first, details were vague, but the curiosity was enough to ignite fire. Social media buzzed with speculation. Some claimed it was a fall, others whispered about abuse. Damian panicked. His publicist drafted statements about a minor household accident. He told investors Elena had fainted. He smiled at galas, insisting everything was fine. For a moment, it seemed his charm might work. But then the truth exploded. One of the guests who had been at the mansion the night of the attack leaked a recording to a journalist. It captured Damian's voice, sharp and arrogant, yelling at Elena, followed by a sickening thud and the maid's scream. The audio was grainy, but undeniable. The next morning, newspapers carried the story in bold letters. Millionaire hurls book at pregnant wife, concussion diagnosed. The headline was everywhere, on morning talk shows, gossip blogs, even mainstream news. Damian's face, once admired, was now plastered alongside words like abuser, tyrant, monster. The story spread so fast it was impossible to contain. Elena, still recovering in her hospital bed, became the unwilling center of attention. Paparazzi swarmed outside, desperate for a photo. Her name trended online. Strangers speculated about her life, her marriage, her choices. Some pitied her, others cruelly blamed her. She should have left him sooner. She only stayed for the money. Why do women put up with this? The humiliation was unbearable. Elena wanted to disappear, to hide her swollen belly from the cameras, to protect her unborn child from the chaos. But every time she closed her eyes, she heard Damian's voice. Think about the baby. Scandal isn't good for children. Now, it wasn't the scandal hurting the baby. It was Damian himself. Her mother, Margaret Lewis, stood firm. She issued her own statement, calm and direct, speaking not only as a mother, but as a neurologist. My daughter suffered a concussion. This was no accident. I will not stay silent while my daughter and her unborn child are endangered. Her words struck like lightning. Unlike Damian's hollow excuses, Margaret's voice carried weight. She wasn't just a grieving mother. She was a respected doctor with decades of credibility. The public began to rally behind her. Women shared their own stories of abuse under hashtags like Justice for Elena. Survivors wrote letters of support. Talk shows invited experts to discuss the dangers of head trauma during pregnancy. The more Damian tried to silence the narrative, the louder it grew. His business partners grew uneasy. At a corporate dinner meant to reassure investors, the tension was palpable. Cameras flashed as Damian strutted into the ballroom with Cassandra on his arm, smiling as if nothing were wrong. But instead of admiration, he was met with whispers, glares, and flashing phones recording his every move. Midway through the evening, a brave journalist shouted from across the room, "Damian, did you really throw a book at your pregnant wife?" The crowd gasped. Damian froze for a fraction of a second before plastering on his trademark smirk. "Ridiculous rumor," he said smoothly. "People love to exaggerate." But the damage was done. The footage of him brushing it off, standing smug beside his mistress while his wife lay in the hospital, went viral overnight. Memes mocked his arrogance. Hashtags demanded boycotts of his companies. Sponsors pulled out of partnerships. What he feared most, public humiliation, was no longer a threat. It was a reality. For Elena, the humiliation cut even deeper. She wasn't just the victim of abuse, she was now the subject of gossip, dissected by strangers. Reporters shouted questions as she was wheeled to doctor's appointments. "Will you divorce him? Is it true he cheated? Are you scared for your baby?" Every flash of a camera felt like another wound. But amid the storm, something unexpected happened. Elena began to realize she was no longer invisible. For years, Damian had silenced her, made her believe her voice didn't matter. Now the world was listening. The humiliation was painful, but it was also a weapon. If she spoke, her words could cut through Damian's lies louder than any headline. With her mother's encouragement, Elena agreed to attend the next court hearing publicly. It was terrifying. She knew cameras would be there, critics waiting, but as she stood in front of the courthouse steps, her hand resting on her belly, she finally raised her voice. "I did not fall. I was not clumsy. My husband threw a book at me while I was pregnant, and I will not be silenced." The crowd erupted, some with applause, some with gasps, some with tears. The humiliation that once crushed her now became her strength. The cameras caught every word, every tremble in her voice, every ounce of courage it took to stand there. And for the first time, Damian wasn't the one in control of the story. But inside the courthouse, Damian leaned toward his lawyer, his eyes burning with rage. "If she wants war," he hissed, "I'll give her war." And that night, as Elena tried to sleep, a mysterious message appeared on her phone. "Drop the charges, or you'll regret it." The days following her public statement were the hardest of Elena Carter's life. For one brief moment, she had felt strong standing on those courthouse steps. She had spoken her truth, and the world had listened. But strength is not steady. It comes and goes like waves. And when the waves receded, what was left was exhaustion, fear, and despair. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages. Some were supportive, letters from women she had never met, strangers who told her she gave them courage. But others were vicious. Anonymous threats filled her inbox. "You're ruining his career. Greedy liar, you'll regret this." Each word chipped away at her fragile hope. The message that haunted her most was the anonymous warning. "Drop the charges, or you'll regret it." It echoed in her mind at night, feeding her paranoia. She began to jump at every sound. A knock on the door made her heart race. A shadow in the hallway made her clutch her belly protectively. Her mother tried to comfort her. Margaret sat by her bed, stroking her hair like she had when Elena was a child. "You are safe, sweetheart. I won't let anything happen to you or the baby." But Elena wasn't sure she believed it. Damian's reach was long, his money endless. He had powerful friends in politics, in business, even in the media. If he wanted to destroy her, could anyone really stop him? One evening, as rain lashed against the hospital windows, Elena broke down completely. She sat curled on the bed, hugging her swollen belly, tears soaking her gown. "I can't do this, Mom," she whispered. "I'm not strong enough. What if I lose the baby? What if he finds a way to take everything from me?" Margaret knelt beside her, gripping her hands. "Listen to me, Elena. You are stronger than you think. You survived that night. You survived him, and you are not alone." But Elena shook her head. She felt alone. Terribly, unbearably alone. The weight of the humiliation pressed down on her chest. Everywhere she turned, she saw reminders of what she had lost. Her teaching job, her marriage, her privacy, her peace. Even her pregnancy, once a source of joy, now felt overshadowed by fear. She worried constantly. What if the stress harmed the baby? What if the concussion had left unseen damage? Every doctor's appointment was a battle against dread. The nights were the worst. When the hospital quieted, when the lights dimmed, memories attacked her. She replayed the moment Damian hurled the book, the sickening sound of it hitting her skull, the way the room had spun. Sometimes she woke gasping, convinced she was still on that cold marble floor. One night, unable to sleep, she wandered into the hospital chapel. It was empty, lit only by a single flickering candle. She sank into a pew, clasped her hands, and whispered through tears, "Please, give me strength, not for me, but for my baby. I don't know how to go on." Her sobs filled the silence. She didn't notice the nurse who paused at the doorway, wiping her own eyes before quietly leaving. The breakdown spread beyond Elena's mind. Her body began to falter too. One afternoon, during a checkup, her blood pressure spiked dangerously. The doctor warned her that stress could trigger early labor. "You need peace," he said gently. "You need to protect yourself from further trauma." But how could she find peace when her husband waged war against her? Meanwhile, Damian escalated his attacks. Through his lawyers, he painted Elena as unstable. "She's emotional. She's exaggerating. Pregnancy hormones, you know how it is," one of his attorneys sneered on live television. Cassandra, his mistress, fueled the fire with social media posts mocking Elena's sob story. The cruelty spread like poison. Strangers repeated Damian's lies, calling Elena dramatic, calling her weak. The isolation deepened. There was a moment, late one night, when despair nearly broke her completely. She sat on the hospital balcony, rain misting her skin, staring down at the dark streets below. For the briefest second, she wondered if the world would be better off without her. If her baby would be safer with her mother, far from the chaos Damian had created. But then the baby kicked. The tiny, undeniable reminder of life inside her jolted her back from the edge. She placed her trembling hands on her belly and whispered, "I'm sorry. I can't give up. I can't leave you." The tears that followed were different, not only of despair, but of release. She realized that her pain wasn't just hers anymore. She carried a child, and with that came a responsibility bigger than fear. Her breakdown was not the end. It was the bottom of the pit, the darkest night before dawn. And as she lay back down in bed, exhausted but still breathing, she began to understand something her mother had been trying to tell her all along. Strength isn't about never falling. It's about rising after the fall. Still, the darkness hadn't vanished. Damian was relentless. The threats grew sharper. One night, the hospital staff discovered a stranger trying to enter her room under false credentials. Security intervened just in time. Elena was shaken to her core. If Damian, or his allies were willing to go this far, what else could they do? Her breakdown reached its peak the next morning, when she collapsed into her mother's arms and whispered, "I don't think I can fight him anymore. I don't think I can win." Margaret held her tight, her voice fierce and steady. "Then let me fight for you. Let me be your strength until you find your own again." And at that moment, Margaret revealed she had evidence, a secret Damian never knew she possessed, one that could turn the entire case upside down. Elena stared at her mother, tears still wet on her cheeks. Margaret's words cut through the fog of despair like a lightning bolt. "I have evidence Damian doesn't know exists." For a moment, Elena couldn't process it. She had been drowning in fear, convinced Damian's power was unshakable. But now her mother's calm certainty stirred a flicker of hope she hadn't felt in weeks. "What do you mean?" Elena whispered, clutching her mother's hands. Margaret's gaze was steady, her voice low but filled with quiet fire. "The night Damian hurt you, he wasn't as careful as he thinks. There were cameras." Elena blinked. "Cameras?" Margaret nodded. "I installed a discreet security system in your home months ago. You didn't know, because I didn't want to intrude. But I had a terrible feeling about him. I couldn't explain it. I just knew. I've seen too many women in my practice suffer from accidents that weren't accidents. I couldn't let that happen to you. So I made sure there was proof." The room seemed to tilt. Elena's heart pounded as she tried to absorb the weight of those words. Proof, actual evidence. The very thing Damian had always believed he could erase with his money and influence. Margaret continued. "The cameras in the living room captured everything. His voice, his anger, the moment he threw the book. And your collapse. It's all there, Elena. He can't lie his way out of it." Elena's breath caught. For so long, Damian had controlled the narrative, twisting truth into lies, convincing the world she was unstable. Now, for the first time, she had something that could destroy his mask. But with the relief came fear. "If he finds out you have this, Mom, he'll come after you. He'll do anything to bury it." Margaret squeezed her daughter's hand. "Let him try. I've faced men like him in the courtroom before. Bullies always believe they're untouchable. But evidence is a weapon even the powerful cannot always crush." The next day, Margaret met privately with the prosecutor. She handed over the footage, a USB drive that seemed to glow with the weight of justice. The prosecutor's eyes widened as he watched, the audio filling the small office. Damian's voice sharp with cruelty, the thud of the book, Elena's gasp of pain, the maid's horrified scream. "This," the prosecutor said, his voice trembling slightly, "changes everything." Word of the evidence spread quickly among the legal team. Damian's lawyers scrambled when they heard whispers of video proof. They demanded disclosure, already preparing strategies to discredit it. But Margaret had made sure the chain of custody was airtight. The evidence was clean, indisputable. The twist hit the media like an earthquake. When the story leaked that there was video proof of the assault, public opinion shifted violently. Where there had once been doubt, there was now outrage. Hashtags turned into movements. Protesters gathered outside Damian's office building, chanting for justice. Sponsors and investors fled in droves. For Damian, the revelation was a nightmare. He had always believed money could bury truth, but now truth had clawed its way to the surface, sharp and undeniable. His arrogance cracked. Behind closed doors, he raged, smashing glasses, yelling at Cassandra, threatening his own legal team. "Find a way to make it disappear," he shouted. But even his most loyal allies began to abandon him. No one wanted to sink with a ship so obviously doomed. Elena, for the first time, began to feel the tide turning. The humiliation she had endured was no longer her shame, it was his. She wasn't the fragile wife anymore. She was the woman who had survived and stood strong enough to expose him. Still, victory was not assured. Damian was cornered, and cornered men are dangerous. His lawyers filed motions to suppress the video, arguing it was an invasion of privacy. Cassandra began a smear campaign online, spreading lies about Elena's mental health. Rumors swirled about bribed witnesses, about judges being pressured. Margaret warned her daughter, "We've wounded him, but that makes him more unpredictable. He won't go down quietly." And she was right. One evening, as Elena rested in her hospital room, her phone buzzed with a new message. This time it wasn't anonymous. It was from Damian. The text was chilling in its simplicity. "Play that video in court, and you'll never see me again. Neither will the baby. Elena's hands shook as she read it. Fear returned like a storm, crashing against the fragile hope she had built. She showed the phone to her mother, who paled but remained calm. "We'll show this to the prosecutor," Margaret said firmly. "Threats like this only prove his guilt. He's digging his own grave." But Elena couldn't shake the terror. Damian wasn't just a bully, he was desperate now. And desperation made him dangerous. That night, Elena dreamed of running down endless hallways, her baby crying somewhere in the distance, Damian's shadow always just behind her. She woke in a sweat, clutching her belly, whispering promises of safety. The twist had given her a weapon, but it had also escalated the war. Damian knew he was losing, and he would not go quietly. And as the trial date approached, a shocking new witness stepped forward, someone from Damian's inner circle, ready to testify against him. But whose side were they really on? The night she received Damian's threatening text, Elena felt the familiar pull of despair. For hours she sat in silence, staring at the glow of her phone screen, the words etched into her mind like a scar. "Play that video in court, and you'll never see me again. Neither will the baby." Her old self would have collapsed under the weight of it, trembling, retreating into fear. But something had changed. The breakdown she had suffered had stripped her to the core. And in that vulnerable place, she had found a new truth. Survival was no longer enough. She couldn't just endure Damian. She had to defeat him. The next morning, Elena stood before the hospital mirror, studying her reflection. The woman looking back was pale, exhausted, her hair limp from weeks of stress. Yet in her eyes burned something Damian had never seen before: defiance. Her mother entered quietly, carrying a garment bag. "It's time," Margaret said softly. Inside was a dress, not extravagant, not gaudy, but elegant and powerful. Navy blue, tailored to her changing body, it framed her figure with dignity. Margaret explained, "This isn't about fashion, it's about reminding him, and reminding you, that you are not broken, you are still here." Elena hesitated, then slipped into the dress. When she turned back to the mirror, her breath caught. For the first time since the marriage began to crumble, she didn't see a victim. She saw a woman reclaiming herself. The transformation wasn't just outward. Over the following days, Elena worked with a therapist arranged by her mother. She practiced grounding exercises, learned to steady her breath when panic rose, and spoke aloud the words she had been too afraid to say. "He doesn't control me. Not anymore." Each time she repeated it, her voice grew stronger. Meanwhile, her legal team prepared her for court. At first, Elena dreaded the questions. What if she froze? What if Damian's lawyers twisted her words? But with practice, she began to hold her ground. She learned to meet their eyes, to answer calmly, to refuse intimidation. The woman who once whispered apologies now spoke with clarity. The woman who once trembled at Damian's anger now faced his lawyers without flinching. Outside the courtroom, the transformation became public. On the day of the next hearing, Elena arrived flanked by her mother and her legal team. Cameras swarmed, flashes exploding like fireworks. But instead of shrinking back, Elena stood tall, one hand resting protectively on her belly, the other waving politely to supporters. Reporters shouted questions. For the first time, Elena didn't hide. She looked directly at them and said, "I am here to seek justice, not just for myself, but for every woman who has been silenced." The clip went viral within hours. Social media, once filled with doubt and cruelty, now overflowed with admiration. Women called her brave, men called her strong, survivors called her an inspiration. Elena's transformation wasn't just about her, it was becoming a movement. Inside the courtroom, Damian saw it too. He sat at the defendant's table, his jaw tight, watching the wife he once controlled now command the room. Her navy dress, her steady posture, her unwavering gaze, all of it infuriated him. He leaned toward Cassandra, whispering through clenched teeth, "She thinks this makes her powerful. She has no idea what's coming." But for the first time, Damian's words rang hollow, even to himself. The power was slipping. As the trial continued, Elena's transformation deepened. She no longer recoiled when Damian's name was mentioned. She no longer cried when false stories surfaced in the press. Instead, she met every challenge with resolve. She poured her pain into determination, her fear into fuel. Her mother noticed the shift. One evening as they prepared for the next day in court, Margaret smiled softly. "You remind me of myself when I was your age," she said. "Fierce, but hiding it until the world pushed too hard. I always knew you had this in you." Elena shook her head. "I don't feel fierce. I feel tired." Margaret touched her hand. "Strength isn't about how you feel. It's about what you do despite how you feel. And look at what you're doing, Elena. You're fighting." That night, Elena lay awake, her baby kicking gently inside her. She whispered into the darkness, "We'll be okay. I promise. I'm not afraid of him anymore." But transformation is never smooth. With each step forward, new challenges emerged. Damian's lawyers launched a brutal campaign, dragging Elena's personal life into the spotlight. They accused her of exaggerating, of fabricating the assault, of manipulating public sympathy. They even leaked private photos of her from happier times with Damian, claiming they showed a loving marriage. For a moment, the old doubts returned. But this time, Elena didn't break. She held a press conference, calmly addressing the lies. "Yes, I once smiled beside him. Yes, I once believed in him. But those moments do not erase the night he hurt me, nor do they erase the truth." The public roared with support. Her transformation was nearly complete. She was no longer the silent, suffering wife. She was a fighter, a voice, a symbol. Then came the most dramatic shift of all. On the eve of the final hearing, Elena walked into the courthouse wearing a simple white suit. It was a deliberate choice. White, the color of renewal, of clarity, of truth. She walked past Damian without flinching, past Cassandra without a glance, straight to her seat. Cameras flashed, capturing the image that would appear on front pages the next morning. The pregnant woman who dared to stand against power, unbroken and unafraid. The courtroom fell silent as she prepared to testify. Her transformation complete. She would tell her story, not as a victim, but as a survivor, demanding justice. But just as she was sworn in, the doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and the mysterious witness who had promised to testify against Damian finally entered, sending a shockwave through the room. It was someone no one expected. The heavy doors creaked open, and all eyes turned. The witness who entered the courtroom that morning wasn't a stranger. It was Cassandra Blake. Gasps rippled through the room. Damian stiffened in his chair, his eyes widening in disbelief. His mistress, the woman he had flaunted at galas, the woman who had whispered poison into his ear, now walked toward the witness stand in a fitted black dress, her heels striking the marble floor like gunshots. Elena's heart pounded. She had expected someone from Damian's business circle, maybe a betrayed associate or a disillusioned employee. She had never expected Cassandra. The judge called for silence as Cassandra raised her hand and swore to tell the truth. Then, in a voice steady but sharp, she began. "I was there the night Damian threw the book at Elena Carter," she said. "I was in the hallway, waiting for him. I heard the fight, I heard his shouting, and I saw what happened afterward. He didn't care that she was on the ground. He only cared that people had witnessed it. He told me to stay quiet. He told me to say it was a fall. And for weeks, I obeyed, but I can't anymore." The room erupted. Cameras clicked furiously. Reporters scribbled notes with shaking hands. Even the judge banged her gavel for order. Damian leapt to his feet, his face red with fury. "Liar!" he roared. "You're doing this because I ended things with you." Cassandra's lips curved into a cold smile. "Ended things? Damian, you never ended anything. You just thought you could trade me in like you did your wife. But unlike her, I don't fear you anymore." The words cut like glass. Elena sat frozen, torn between shock and vindication. Cassandra wasn't her ally, not truly. This wasn't about loyalty to Elena. This was revenge against Damian. But in that moment, it didn't matter. Her testimony was damning. The prosecution wasted no time. They played the security footage Margaret had provided. The screen in the courtroom lit up with Damian's voice, Damian's rage, the sickening thud of the book striking Elena's head. Gasps filled the room again, louder this time, some people even covering their mouths in horror. Then came Cassandra's testimony, perfectly aligning with the footage. The case against Damian was airtight. Elena watched him unravel. The man who once strutted through life with arrogance now sat slumped, sweating, his lawyers whispering frantically in his ear. He looked smaller than she had ever seen him. His smirk was gone. His power was slipping through his fingers like sand. The prosecution ended with a fiery statement. "This is not just a case of assault. This is a case about abuse of power. Damian Carter believed his money made him untouchable. He believed he could hurt his wife, silence witnesses, and manipulate the truth. But today, the truth has spoken, and justice will be served. The gallery erupted in applause before the judge demanded silence again. Elena was next to testify. She rose slowly, one hand steadying her swollen belly. The courtroom hushed. All cameras turned to her. Her voice trembled at first, but then it grew stronger. She described the years of manipulation, the way Damian belittled her, the loneliness of the mansion, the fear that haunted her every day. She recounted the night of the attack, the sound of the book, the blackout, waking in the hospital to her mother's determined face. Tears filled her eyes as she said, "For years, I believed I was powerless. I believed my voice didn't matter. But I was wrong. And today I am here to say, not just for myself, but for every woman who has been silenced, you are not powerless. You are not alone." The gallery erupted again, this time with cheers. Even the judge looked moved as she instructed the crowd to settle. Damian's lawyers tried to cross-examine, but Elena stood firm. Every attempt to rattle her fell flat. She answered with calm dignity, refusing to let them twist her words. By the time she stepped down, the room was buzzing with admiration. Cassandra's betrayal, Margaret's evidence, and Elena's testimony formed an unbreakable chain. Damian's empire was collapsing in real time, right in front of him. But Damian wasn't finished. As the hearing ended, he turned to Elena, his face contorted with rage. His voice was low, but she heard it clearly. "This isn't over. You think you've won, but you haven't seen what I can do." The bailiff stepped closer, ready to escort him out, but Damian leaned forward one last time. His eyes burned with desperation. The mask of the powerful millionaire now stripped away, revealing the monster beneath. Elena met his gaze without flinching. For the first time in their marriage, she wasn't afraid. She didn't shrink. She didn't cry. She simply stared back, her silence louder than his threats. The crowd watched, breathless, as the once dominant man was led away in handcuffs to await sentencing. Cameras flashed, capturing the moment that would make headlines across the world. The millionaire abuser finally brought low. Outside, protesters cheered. Supporters waved signs reading, "Justice for Elena" and "No more silence." The city had chosen its side, and it wasn't his. But as Elena stepped into the sunlight, the crowd chanting her name, she couldn't shake one thought. Damian was right about one thing. It wasn't over. He still had resources, allies, secrets. And desperate men with nothing to lose are the most dangerous of all. That night, as Elena prepared for the sentencing hearing, her lawyer received an anonymous tip. Damian had one last card to play. Something so shocking it could shake the entire case before the verdict was read. The sentencing hearing drew more attention than any trial the city had seen in years. Outside the courthouse, the streets swelled with reporters and supporters holding signs. "Justice for Elena. No more silence. Power doesn't excuse abuse." The chants echoed down the blocks, carried on the wind like a drumbeat of history being made. Inside, the air was electric. Every seat was filled. Camera crews lined the back wall. This wasn't just a legal proceeding anymore. It was a reckoning. Elena sat quietly at the plaintiff's table, her mother beside her. She was calm, dressed once again in white, a symbol of renewal. Her hands rested gently on her pregnant belly. No matter the outcome, she knew she had already transformed. She had stood up, she had spoken, she had fought. But Damian wasn't finished. His lawyers filed a last-minute motion, claiming to possess evidence that would discredit Elena. Whispers rippled through the courtroom as a folder of documents was passed to the judge. Damian leaned back in his chair, a smug smile tugging at his lips. It was his final card, his last chance to reclaim control. The judge flipped through the papers, her expression unreadable. The room waited, tense and breathless. Then, in a calm but firm voice, the judge spoke. "These documents are fabricated." A stunned silence followed. Damian's face blanched. "The signatures are forgeries. The dates don't align. This is a blatant attempt to obstruct justice." Gasps erupted. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras flashed. The judge's gavel struck hard. "This court will not tolerate such deception." Elena's lawyer rose immediately. "Your Honor, this proves once again that Mr. Carter believes he is above the law. He tried to falsify evidence in a desperate bid to escape accountability. This only strengthens the case against him." The judge nodded, her gaze fixed on Damian. Enough games. We will proceed with sentencing. Damian's mask finally shattered. He slammed his fist on the table, shouting, "You can't do this to me. I built this city. I made these people rich. Without me, you're nothing." His voice echoed through the chamber, wild and desperate. Bailiffs moved quickly, restraining him. The image of the once untouchable millionaire, now reduced to a raging, handcuffed man, was broadcast across every network. It was the fall of a giant, the end of a myth. When order was restored, the judge read the sentence. For the crime of aggravated assault against your pregnant wife, and for attempting to obstruct justice, Damian Carter, you are hereby sentenced to prison. Justice will be served. The gavel fell, sharp and final. The room erupted. Cheers from the gallery, tears from Elena's supporters, gasps of relief. Reporters rushed to broadcast the verdict. Headlines would declare it within minutes. Millionaire Damian Carter sentenced, justice for Elena Carter. Elena closed her eyes, exhaling a breath she didn't realize she had been holding for months. Tears filled her eyes, not of fear, but of release. Margaret squeezed her hand, whispering, "It's over, sweetheart. It's finally over." But Elena shook her head softly. "No, Mom. It's not just over. It's the beginning." Outside the courthouse, Elena stepped into the sunlight. The crowd erupted in cheers, chanting her name. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward, but for the first time she didn't feel overwhelmed. She raised her hand for silence, and the crowd hushed. Her voice carried steady, strong, and clear. "This victory is not just mine. It belongs to every woman who has ever been told to stay silent. Every survivor who has ever been doubted, every person who has ever been made to feel powerless. We are not powerless, we are not voiceless. We are stronger than those who try to break us. And today proves it." Applause thundered. Some cried openly. Others shouted words of encouragement. The moment was more than a verdict, it was a declaration of change. In the weeks that followed, Elena's story spread worldwide. She was invited to speak on talk shows, her face gracing magazine covers, not as Damian Carter's wife, but as a woman who fought and won. She partnered with organizations to support survivors of abuse, her voice becoming a beacon of hope. Her transformation was complete. From a silenced teacher to a broken wife, from a victim to a fighter, Elena Carter had emerged as a leader, an inspiration. And when her baby was born, a healthy little girl with dark hair and curious eyes, Elena held her close and whispered, "You will never know fear the way I did. You will grow up knowing your mother fought for you, and we won." Margaret stood nearby, tears in her eyes, proud beyond words. She had fought as both a doctor and a mother, and now, seeing her daughter and granddaughter safe, she knew it had all been worth it. As for Damian, his empire crumbled. Companies cut ties, properties were seized, allies vanished. In prison, he was just another man stripped of power, left with nothing but the echoes of the arrogance that once defined him. Elena never visited, she never looked back. Her revenge wasn't in his downfall, it was in her rise. Months later, at a gala hosted in support of survivors, Elena walked onto the stage in a simple gown. The crowd rose to its feet in thunderous applause. She smiled, humbled, and began her speech. "My story began in silence. It nearly ended in despair. But because I found the courage to speak and because others stood beside me, I found freedom. To every woman out there, to every survivor, you are not weak, you are not broken, you are not alone. Speak your truth. The world will listen." The room erupted once more, the sound of victory, of solidarity, of change. Elena Carter's journey had begun with pain, humiliation, and fear, but it ended with strength, justice, and hope. And as she held her daughter that night, watching the world applaud, Elena whispered one final promise. "Our future will never be built on fear, it will be built on freedom." So, my wonderful friends, our story has come to a close. And if you're still here with me right now, it means something in Elena's journey touched your heart in a personal way. Maybe it reminded you of your own battles, or maybe it whispered a quiet truth you needed to hear. That no matter how dark life feels, you are never powerless. The Stoics used to say, you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. Elena's fight wasn't just against Damian, it was against fear, silence, and despair. And she won, and so can you. If this story moved you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who might need courage today. Hit like, subscribe, and join this community where we remind each other that healing is possible, justice is worth fighting for, and freedom begins with truth. Together, let's keep telling stories that give hope.